Welcome to U.S. History Unit 2, the Empire Business. Today we're in Episode 5 of New Lands. We have 5 objectives. You should be able to trace the course of the Spanish-American War and its results, describe the U.S. involvement in Puerto Rico and Cuba, identify the causes and effects of the Philippine-American War. You should be able to explain the purpose of the open door policy in China, be able to summarize the views regarding U.S. imperialism. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 21. Public opinion about the Spanish-American War solidified behind the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And to avoid war, Spain agreed to basically every demand of the United States, including a 6-month ceasefire in Cuba. Nevertheless, on April 11th of 1898, McKinley asked Congress for a greater declaration of force, and on April 20th, the U.S. declared war. The first battle with Spain occurred not in Cuba, but in the Spanish colony of the Philippines, where American ships could attack the Navy unexpectedly. On April 30th, Commodore George Dewey trapped the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Manila. The next morning, he opened fire. The attack was so intense that a huge cloud of explosion smoke totally blocked the view of the Spanish, yet Dewey continued to order the attack. Dewey's victory allowed the U.S. troops to land in the Philippines. Although not as extreme as in Cuba, the pattern of Spanish oppression was similar in the Philippines, and they had a similar revolt movement led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who supported Dewey's efforts to take the islands. On August of 1898, Spanish troops in Manila surrendered to the United States, and the Spanish ultimately lost control of the Philippines. Now, in the Caribbean, it goes a little differently. U.S. presence in the Cuba began with a naval blockade, sealing off the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Santiago. Unlike the Navy, the Army was a pretty small army, and the U.S. professionals, there wasn't a big professional force for it. They made up were mostly ill-prepared and ill-supplied volunteers. Around 125,000 Americans had volunteered to fight in Cuba, but there weren't enough modern guns to go around, and the uniforms were old Civil War-era uniforms, heavy wool, and they were hardly appropriate for Cuba's tropical climate. The officers were more interested in telling Civil War stories than in training volunteer troops, and they sending them into battle unprepared and under-equipped. In June of 1898, 17,000 troops landed in Santiago de Cuba, including a group known as the Rough Riders, a volunteer cavalry unit under the direction of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. On July 1st, the most famous battle in Cuba took place near Santiago. The first part of the battle was on Kettle Hill, with a risky uphill charge by 2 African-American regiments and the Rough Riders. They cleared the way for the U.S. to take the more strategically important San Juan Hill. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders actually only played a fairly minor role, but Roosevelt was always good at making his own fame known, and so he became like the hero of San Juan Hill. 2 days later, the Spanish fleet tried to escape the American blockade, and it led to a naval battle that destroyed the entire Spanish fleet, and the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico shortly thereafter. And Spain and the United States signed an armistice agreement in August of 1898, then met in Paris to make a treaty. An armistice is just an agreement to stop fighting. It's not an end to the war, with the actual fighting ending in 1898 in the August of that year. Secretary of State John Hay called the conflict a splendid little war, with the actual fighting only lasting 15 weeks. In terms of the agreement of the Treaty of Paris, Spain freed Cuba, they handed over Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and arranged the sale of the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The Treaty of Paris ultimately started a debate over imperialism, or the bigger question of whether it was right to annex the Philippines at all. McKinley, for his part, tried, weakly, to justify the annexation of the Philippines on moral grounds, saying that the Filipinos should be educated and Christianized, seeming to forget the Philippines was actually one of the most Catholic countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Christianity had been practiced in the Philippines since the 1500s. Opponents to imperialism gave political, moral, and economic arguments against annexation. Some felt that it was a violation of the Declaration of Independence, at least to the spirit of it. The African-American advocate Booker T. Washington wrote that the United States should take care of race issues at home before taking on social problems elsewhere, and even people like Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor feared that Filipinos would ultimately compete with American jobs. Nevertheless, the Treaty of Paris was ratified by Congress in 1899 and gave the U.S. an empire, including Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Roman numeral 22. During the Spanish-American War, General Nelson Miles occupied Puerto Rico, promising Puerto Ricans that the United States was there to protect their lives and property. The protection was carried out by military rule. Puerto Rico's real value, though, was a strategic post in the Caribbean, and because it was a good launching site for protection of a future Panama Canal. In 1900, the Foraker Act ended the military rule and set up a civil government there, where the president appointed the island's governor and also appointed the upper house of the legislature. In 1917, Puerto Ricans were made U.S. citizens and could elect both houses of their legislature, subpoint B. When Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory, the United States always planned to give Cuba its independence from Spain. It was never intended to be kept as a U.S. territory. Afterwards, after the Spanish-American War, the United States occupied Cuba for a little bit, and they even kept some of the same people in government jobs as during the Spanish rule. A lot of Cubans, particularly Jose Marti, whom we met last class. Jose Marti was the Cuban patriot who led the rebellion against Spain. He feared that the United States would rule Cuba the same way as the Spanish did, and those fears seem to be justified, as any Cubans who protested American transition end up throwing in jail or kicked off the island. On the other hand, the American military government did do things that the Spanish weren't doing, rebuilding the country after a destructive guerrilla war, providing humanitarian relief like clothing and food for thousands of displaced Cubans, but also rebuilding farms and elementary schools and sanitation improvements, which ultimately did have some long-term positive effects on Cuba, although you can always ask whether, the trade-off was worth it. Some point C. In 1900, Cuba wrote its own constitution. But surprising to Americans, it didn't mention anything about its relationship with the United States. So the United States insisted that Cuba add what became known as the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment specified several things about the relationship between the two countries. Under the Platt Amendment, Cuba could not go into debt that its government couldn't repay, and it couldn't make treaties that limited its independence or allow a foreign power to control Cuban land. And the United States said they had a right to intervene in Cuba, and the United States could buy or lease land on the island for naval or refueling stations. Essentially, the United States strong-armed its own interests into the Cuban Constitution. The United States refused to withdraw its troops until Cuba passed the amendment, which set off torchlight protests to the Governor General Leonard Wood's house. Others said that Cuba should resume its war, basically go and fight for its own independence again, but with the United States this time instead of the Spanish. The United States stood firm, and eventually Cuba adopted the Platt Amendment in 1903. Cuba ultimately became a protectorate of the United States. A protectorate is a country whose affairs are partly controlled by a stronger one. Subpoint D. The United States wanted a stronger presence in Cuba to go protect American businesses, particularly in the industries of sugar, tobacco, mining, and railroads and utilities. A lot of Americans were objecting to the colonial entanglements, thinking they weren't necessary for business, and ultimately the colonies were un-American. Still, the United States State Department continued to push control for Latin America, Roman numeral 23. Filipinos were outraged at the Treaty of Paris' call for annexation because they were basically sold out between one country to another. In 1899, our old friend Emilio Aguinaldo led a new fight, this time against the United States instead of the Spanish. When Aguinaldo used the same guerrilla tactics to cause chaos for Americans, the United States forced Filipinos to live in designated zones in poor conditions. During the American occupation, white American soldiers tended to see Filipinos as an inferior race, and African American troops were troubled with the spreading prejudice, and a lot of African American troops ultimately deserted the U.S. Army to go join the Filipino side in protest. It took about 3 years to put down this rebellion, and around 20,000 Filipinos died in the fight for independence, 4,000 Americans died, and around $400 million in damage was the result. The United States set up a government in the Philippines similar to that of Puerto Rico. The American president appointed a governor and also appointed the upper house of the legislature, and people elected the lower house. The Philippines did become independent on July 4th of 1946 in the proceedings related to World War II. Roman numeral 24. Let's change our topics a little bit, but still stay out of imperialism. And we'll talk about how the United States became involved in China. The United States' main interest in the Philippines ultimately was really a gateway to China. China was seen as a vast potential market and investment opportunity. China was not a strong country at the time. It was weakened by years of war and foreign meddling and was referred to often as the sick man of Asia, with France, Britain, Japan, and Russia with settlements and spheres of influence in the country. It prompted John Hay to issue what became known as the Open Door Notes, fearing that China would be carved into European colonies and the United States would be shut out of the deal. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay issued the Open Door Notes. Open Door Notes were letters of policy statements to the leaders of imperialist nations. The countries share their trading rights with the United States, making sure that no country would have a monopoly on trade with any part of China, or basically keeping an open door. The other powers reluctantly agreed. Subpoint C. Although China remained a free country, European powers dominated most of its major cities. Some Chinese formed secret societies. The most famous of the secret societies was known as the Boxers, or more formally, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, but everybody calls them the Boxers. The societies wanted to expel foreigners and foreign influence. The Boxers killed hundreds of thousands of foreigners and any Chinese people that had the audacity to become Christian. In August of 1900, the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, and Japan all teamed up to put down the Boxer Rebellion. They marched on the Chinese capital and forced the end of the rebellion. Thousands of Chinese people died during the fighting. Subpoint D. The rebellion was ultimately put down. I've said ultimately a lot in this. Whoops. After the rebellion was put down, the U.S. feared the U.S. imperialists would use the rebellion as an excuse to take further control of China. So John Hay responded by issuing new open door notes, saying the United States, their job was to safeguard for the world the principle of equal and impartial trade with all parts of the Chinese empire, and ultimately to keep... I did it again. And say to keep the trade open. The open door policy reflected our beliefs about the U.S. economy. The growth depended on exports, and the United States had the right to keep international markets open. The closing the area of trade would threaten survival of America. These beliefs became the backbone of U.S. foreign policy. They still tend to be the backbone of U.S. foreign policy. We love the idea of doing business and don't like the idea of anybody getting in our way. Roman numeral 25. When McKinley took office in 1895, part of his platform was that he was running as a non-imperialist, wanting to make sure he would stay out of the empire business. By 1900, though, he had totally changed his position. He was a confirmed imperialist. In 1896, he ran against William Jennings Bryan. You remember the issue there was bimetallism and the question of monetary policy and creating inflation for farmers. William Jennings Bryan ran again against McKinley in 1900, this time only on the Democratic Party. He was not also running as a populist, but he lost it anyhow. He was a confirmed McKinley was a confirmed imperialist. Bryan was strongly anti-imperialist and was a key member of the Anti-Imperialist League. The Anti-Imperialist League was a group of thinkers, some of the most prominent people in America, such as former President Grover Cleveland and industrialist Andrew Carnegie, the social worker Jane Addams, and the writer Mark Twain. The anti-imperialists said that it was wrong for the United States to rule over people without their consent. Nevertheless, U.S. imperialism would continue throughout the first part of the 20th century. When you finish this slide, you may save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you. Remember to like and subscribe.